Under the tall oaks of a quiet cul-de-sac in suburban Oregon, the late afternoon sun fell across a neighborhood that appeared to any outsider idyllic. Lawns were manicured with almost militant precision, driveways swept clean, American flags fluttered in sync, and porch chairs sat empty and waiting, as if their owners had just stepped inside for a moment. Yet beneath the surface calm of this private community, tension simmered. Not the kind that screamed or broke windows, but the kind that lived in glances, in withheld greetings, in cars that slowed just a second too long in front of the wrong house. And at the very edge of that neat world lived Susan McCoy, a woman who had learned long ago that silence and order did not always mean peace. Susan had moved into the neighborhood 3 years earlier after the sudden death of her husband, Mark, a fire captain with over 20 years of service. He had died not in some dramatic blaze but from a stroke, collapsing quietly in the locker room after a routine inspection of a residential home's smoke detectors. The irony of it was not lost on Susan. Mark had once crawled out of a burning apartment building with a child in each arm, and yet it was the simplest of days that claimed him. For months afterward, she had floated through grief in that strange state of numb awareness, making decisions in a fog. Selling their old home, smaller and full of memories she couldn't bear to relive daily, was the hardest of those choices. She hadn't wanted to move here, to a place where the houses all looked like they were designed from the same template, where the trees were too young to offer real shade, and where the rules stretched thicker than the sidewalks. But something about this neighborhood had appealed to her then. Maybe it was the promise of security, maybe the quiet, or maybe the fact that nobody knew her yet. She could be someone new here, someone who didn't carry the image of a folded flag and a pair of empty boots wherever she went. Susan chose the corner lot intentionally. It was the only home adjacent to the fire access road, a lane meant strictly for emergency vehicles and utility access. Her husband would have approved. He used to say, "When seconds count, access is everything." And in the quiet moments, early mornings or evenings just before dusk, Susan would walk along the edge of that road, sipping coffee or cradling a cup of tea, feeling strangely reassured by its presence. It wasn't a street anyone used for leisure. It had no sidewalk, no houses facing it directly, and was marked with stern red and white signage stating, "Emergency access only, no parking." Over time, Susan had come to treat that strip of pavement almost like a boundary between her world and the one she had left behind. The rest of the neighborhood, however, was less reverent. The fire lane was rarely discussed, rarely even noticed by the residents, unless it interfered with something they wanted, like landscaping, or guest parking, or, in Karen Hopkins' case, a garden party. Karen had arrived in the community just over a year ago, and unlike Susan, she had not arrived quietly. With her designer bags, constant renovations, and a voice that carried 3 lots over, Karen made herself known. She was the kind of woman who smiled with too many teeth and always spoke with an undercurrent of performance, as if narrating her life for a reality show that existed only in her mind. When she moved in, she immediately began hosting events, first small gatherings, then charity luncheons, then full-blown community evenings with live music and caterers. She was quickly absorbed into the neighborhood's unofficial power circle, not elected, not formal, but just as influential as any city council. Karen's talent wasn't charm, it was control. She knew how to ask for things as if she were granting favors, and when she wanted something, she didn't so much request it as assume it into being. For the most part, Susan had stayed out of her way. She declined the invitations politely, kept to herself, and focused on her own routines. But it was impossible not to notice Karen's presence. Her parties spilled over with expensive lighting and decor. Her landscaping grew more elaborate by the week, and her voice, often laced with sugar and warning, carried over fences and into windows. Susan could hear her sometimes in the evenings, giving instructions to gardeners or talking on the phone about the new committee agenda, like she was planning a boardroom takeover. things came to a quiet head one morning in early June. Susan was out early, watering her garden, when she noticed workers unloading what looked like decorative iron arches and metal poles from a flatbed truck right at the mouth of the fire lane. At first, she assumed it was a mistake, that perhaps the crew had misread the address or misunderstood the location. But when she approached one of the men and asked what they were doing, he glanced at a clipboard and said flatly, "Event Installation, Garden Gala, authorized by Ms. Hopkins." That night, Susan sat on her porch long after the sun had gone down, watching the structures take shape under the glow of mobile construction lights. A series of white tents went up, along with a small stage, rows of ornamental planters, and several massive tables, each placed squarely across the fire lane. She said nothing. Not yet. She wasn't the type to yell over property lines or start fights over logistics. But as she watched the crew drill anchors into the pavement and run cords across the emergency access, her stomach churned. She had lived a lifetime with men and women who had died because an entrance was blocked or a vehicle couldn't make the turn. At noon the next day, a paper flyer appeared on every door in the neighborhood. Garden Gala Under the Stars, featuring live jazz, curated wine, and an artisanal grazing table, complete with a note at the bottom. Parking is limited. Please use the emergency access lane for overflow parking. Volunteers will be on site to assist. Susan read the flyer twice, then a third time. The word emergency sat there like a smudge of ash on white linen. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at her desk instead, staring at a framed photo of Mark in his turnout gear, standing next to a fire truck, smiling with that calm that came only when he knew he'd done something right. And it was there, in the stillness of that long night, that Susan decided she wasn't going to look the other way. Not because she wanted a fight, not because she cared about neighborhood dynamics or social control, but because she had watched one too many scenes where people stood in the street, screaming for help that couldn't reach them. And she had promised herself, after Mark's funeral, that she would never again ignore something that could cost a life. The next morning, she made a call to the local fire marshal's office, not with outrage, not with drama, but with clear, factual concern. She asked to speak to someone about a potential violation involving emergency access. When the woman on the line asked for details, Susan gave them: address, dates, description. She ended the call with a simple sentence: "If someone needs help on Saturday night, they won't get it in time." And then she waited. The morning of the event came with unusual quiet. The tents had grown. The tables were now covered in white linens and place settings with calligraphy name cards. Waiters in black and white began appearing around midday, unloading coolers and setting up wine stations. The fire lane was no longer visible at all. From Susan's vantage point, it looked like an upscale wedding reception, right down to the string quartet warming up near the stage. No one noticed her watching from behind her curtained window. No one asked her opinion. That wasn't how this neighborhood worked. At 6:04 p.m., the first ambulance arrived. Sirens low, lights on, turning into the development at a steady, serious speed. Susan's heart stilled when she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel road, followed by a sudden halt, a driver yelling, people scattering, and a voice, sharp and full of command, cutting through the music. "Move the damn tables!" And in that moment, Susan McCoy knew one thing with perfect clarity. She had been right not to stay silent. The sound of the ambulance engine idling against a backdrop of confused chatter echoed across the cul-de-sac like a warning bell no one wanted to hear. It was the kind of disruption that stripped away all illusion. No more curated playlists or clinking glasses, no more polite smiles beneath fairy lights. For a moment, everything that Karen Hopkins had tried to orchestrate came undone, not with chaos, but with hesitation. People moved awkwardly, unsure of whether they were supposed to help or just get out of the way. Two paramedics stepped out of the vehicle, their expressions unreadable but their urgency unmistakable. One of them surveyed the mass of obstacles before him: tables bolted into place, decorative fences, a cocktail station, and a trellis archway decked with climbing roses. All of it now barricading what should have been a clear path. Susan McCoy stood at the edge of her property, arms folded, the same tight, unreadable expression on her face that she used to wear during memorial services. The ambulance lights pulsed silently, coloring everything in surreal shades of red and blue. No sirens now. The noise had been cut as they entered the neighborhood, an unspoken nod to the event, or perhaps a resigned acknowledgement that no one wanted a scene. But a scene was exactly what was unfolding, whether they wanted it or not. The patient, a man in his late 60s, was not Susan's direct neighbor, but she knew his name was Harold. He lived alone 2 doors down and was known for walking every morning, rain or shine. Susan had often seen him wave politely on his way to pick up the newspaper, and occasionally he would stop and compliment her rose garden with a casual nod and a smile that didn't demand conversation. It was his adult daughter, visiting from Bend for the weekend, who had found him slumped on his kitchen floor and called 911. She now stood by the ambulance, visibly shaken, clutching her phone in one hand and a cardigan in the other, her voice trembling as she spoke with the paramedics. The access lane was useless. Even with volunteers now desperately unbolting table legs and dragging floral arrangements to the side, the passage remained blocked. The paramedics, trained for worse, didn't wait. They grabbed their medical bags and ran. Susan watched as they disappeared on foot into the neighborhood's inner loop, each carrying half of what they needed, one of them already pulling on gloves as they moved. It was a sprint she'd seen too many times in the past. Firefighters and medics dashing down narrow hallways or up cluttered staircases, trying to beat a clock that didn't care about best intentions or beautiful weather. By the time they returned with Harold on the gurney, now stabilized but unconscious, the crowd had grown. Karen stood near the tents, trying and failing to retain her composure. Her eyes flicked between guests and emergency responders, her lips moving in quiet explanations. She seemed to be managing appearances more than people, concerned less with the delay than with the optics. She waved off a caterer, gestured at the mess of half-cleared decorations, and turned sharply when one of the paramedics told her to step aside. It was that tone, firm, tired, without space for negotiation, that finally silenced her. Susan didn't speak to anyone. She didn't need to. She knew the medics had marked the delay. She knew the fire department would file a report. And she knew that Karen, despite her frantic charm and excuses, had just made a mistake no amount of smooth talking could unmake. The fire access lane wasn't just a theoretical necessity or some bureaucratic leftover. It was there for a reason. And that reason had just been wheeled away in an ambulance that had taken too long to leave. Later that evening, the party resumed. Not quite with the same energy. Guests were quieter and the music a touch lower. But it went on. Karen, ever the hostess, managed to rally enough presence to deliver a toast about community spirit and cherishing the moments we have. The absurdity of it made Susan want to laugh, but she didn't. She went inside, locked her door, and sat at her kitchen table with the same feeling in her chest she had when she watched a house smolder down to its foundation. Powerless, but not surprised. What followed in the days ahead was what Susan would later describe as the real fallout. And it didn't come from paramedics or fire officials at first. It came from the neighborhood itself. A passive-aggressive tension began to spread through the streets, like smoke lingering after a fire had been put out. Conversations became clipped. People avoided eye contact. Susan noticed that 2 families who had left the party early the night of the incident hadn't returned her wave since. Others, those closer to Karen, seemed to watch her house with careful curiosity, as though gauging how involved she had been in what happened. But Susan didn't guess or speculate. She acted. On Monday morning, she wrote a formal letter to the county fire marshal's office. Not an angry letter, not emotional. It was concise and specific, documenting the exact time and nature of the blockage, the use of the fire lane as an event space, the delay in emergency response, and the visible installation of semi-permanent structures on a designated emergency route. She attached photographs she had taken in broad daylight. Nothing covert, nothing hidden, just images of the tents, the fencing, and the signage that had clearly encouraged attendees to park near the access point. She printed the letter, signed it, and drove it directly to the station herself. She didn't tell anyone what she had done. She didn't need to. The truth had a way of surfacing in its own time. 3 days later, a white SUV with city insignia pulled into the neighborhood. A man in uniform and a clipboard stepped out, walked the length of the fire lane, took pictures, and made notes. Karen stood on her driveway, arms crossed, lips tight. She spoke with him for several minutes. Susan couldn't hear what was said, but she recognized the change in Karen's posture, the moment when control slips away and realization sets in. That same evening, a second car came. This one bore the insignia of the Municipal Safety Committee. More photos, more measuring. Susan didn't watch long. She simply returned inside and poured herself a glass of water, her hands calm for the first time in days. The next day, a flyer appeared on every door in the neighborhood. This one wasn't pastel-colored or printed on cardstock. It was a plain white notice with city letterhead. Public safety violation, unauthorized obstruction of emergency access, it read. There was no mention of names, but everyone knew. The notice stated that an investigation was underway into the June 10th incident, and that further information would be shared with residents following the conclusion of the municipal review. In the meantime, any modifications to emergency lanes, fire access, or designated service routes were to cease immediately and be removed within 72 hours. Karen's decorations were gone the next morning. But that wasn't the end. Not even close. A few days later, Susan received a call from someone she hadn't expected to hear from, the assistant to the regional fire chief. The woman thanked her for her report, stated that the department had reviewed all documentation, and informed her that a formal citation had been issued against the local association for violating emergency regulations. The penalty: $25,000 in municipal fines, not including the pending civil review. Karen hadn't just crossed a line. She had dragged the entire neighborhood across it with her, and now they were all going to feel the consequences. That night, Susan sat outside, wrapped in a shawl, listening to the quiet hum of insects and the distant barking of a dog. She didn't feel victorious. This wasn't that kind of battle. She felt settled, not in the way people often mean it, but in the deep, bone-level sense that comes when you've done the right thing and let the truth carry itself forward. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't pointed fingers or demanded apologies. She had simply told the truth and trusted the system to do the rest. But the damage had been done. Karen's circle had collapsed. The next time Susan saw her, she was standing on the sidewalk alone, talking into her phone with a tight expression and wild hand gestures. The lawn looked less pristine. The front gate sat open a little too long. The aura of polished control was fraying, and Susan watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet resolve of someone who understood something most people chose to forget. Accountability isn't loud. It's patient. It's exact. And when it comes, it doesn't knock. It walks straight through the door. Karen Hopkins did not crumble overnight. The initial citation and public notice rattled her, certainly. It bruised her ego and unsettled her image of invincibility. But it didn't stop her. For people like Karen, damage control was just another form of theater. The week after the fine was announced, she began her counteroffensive with a smile on her face and a clipboard in hand. She visited neighbors one by one, cloaking herself in concern, spinning the situation as a tragic misunderstanding, and blaming unclear signage, outdated maps, and overzealous enforcement. She framed it as if she had been unfairly targeted, as though the entire situation had been an orchestrated smear campaign by someone bitter and looking for a reason to stir trouble. Karen never named Susan directly, But the implication hung in the air like humidity, thick, undeniable, and designed to make its target sweat. It was subtle at first. A few neighbors who had once smiled at Susan began crossing the street a little sooner, ending conversations a little faster. One morning, her garbage can had been wheeled into the middle of her driveway and tipped over, its contents scattered across the asphalt. Another day, she found 2 packages she had been expecting mysteriously delayed, marked as unable to deliver due to obstruction, though her porch was entirely clear and she had been home. And then came the anonymous complaints, subtle digs disguised as formal observations submitted through the community's neighborhood maintenance board. One stated that Susan's front hedges extended too far past the property line. Another claimed her porch light was too bright and caused glare. A third, more pointed, accused her of keeping unauthorized fencing along the side yard, though it had been there since the day she moved in. She recognized the tactic. It was textbook deflection. Flood the target with minor infractions, isolate them socially, and make them feel unwelcome through 1,000 paper cuts. But Susan had survived worse. She had endured the long, slow corrosion of grief and the empty bed that never stopped being a cold void beside her. She had learned to rebuild from a silence that swallowed everything. Compared to that, Karen's pettiness was background noise. Still, the pressure had its effect. By the 3rd week, Susan found herself hesitating before stepping outside, checking through windows before walking to the mailbox, wondering whether each glance from a neighbor was casual or calculated. She began keeping a folder in her desk drawer, marked simply Incidents, where she documented each occurrence, printing copies of emails, delivery notifications, photos of tampered property, and notes from conversations that raised red flags. She didn't know yet what she would do with the file, but she knew better than to wait until she needed it to start collecting. One afternoon, as she returned from a grocery run, Susan found a bright yellow envelope taped to her front door. The bold, capitalized font read, "Neighborhood Notice." Inside, the letter accused her of creating a hostile environment and spreading false information to outside authorities. It warned that repeated actions could result in formal community sanctions. There was no signature, no header, no point of contact, just a typewritten accusation and an underlying tone of menace. It was clearly unofficial, likely written by Karen or someone loyal to her, but the intent was unmistakable. Intimidation. Susan stood on her porch, the letter flapping slightly in the breeze, and felt the familiar surge of injustice rise in her throat. Not rage, not fear, just the acute realization that silence would no longer be enough. Later that evening, she called her attorney, not the one who handled Mark's estate, but a younger lawyer named Caroline Bishop, whom she had met during a town hall meeting months prior. Caroline was sharp, professional, and understood community law in a way that made people like Karen nervous. Susan explained everything, methodically, providing the timeline, the documents, the citations, and the growing list of low-level harassments. Caroline listened without interruption and asked just one question when Susan finished. "Do you want to push back quietly or publicly?" Susan hesitated, then replied, "I don't want to embarrass anyone, but I want it to stop." Caroline said, "Then we document. We don't confront, we prepare." And so began a quiet countermeasure. Susan installed a high-resolution security camera on her front porch, carefully angled to capture the driveway and part of the street without violating anyone's privacy. She updated her delivery instructions to include a specific note about unobstructed access and contacted the local postmaster to file a complaint about the misrouted packages. She submitted formal rebuttals to the neighborhood board regarding the landscaping and lighting complaints, each accompanied by photographic evidence and date-stamped receipts. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. She held 2 neighborhood unity events on her lawn, thinly veiled attempts to solidify her influence and control the narrative. She started a newsletter, distributed bi-weekly, that featured gardening tips, local announcements, and glowing praise for residents who go above and beyond to support our shared values. Susan's name, of course, was never mentioned. But in one issue, a paragraph stood out. It read, "We must remain vigilant against those who would use tragedy as a platform for personal grievance." Susan clipped it and added it to the file. Then came the unexpected escalation. One morning, a city inspector arrived at Susan's door without an appointment, holding a clipboard and a work order. He informed her that there had been a formal request to survey her property boundary due to a potential encroachment on municipal land. The accusation stated that her garden bed, specifically the row of lilies she had planted along the edge of her lot, extended 6 inches past the permitted line. Susan asked to see the complaint. The inspector apologized and said the report was submitted anonymously. It was a calculated move. Most residents would panic, perhaps dig up their yard in a rush to avoid fines. But Susan didn't. She invited the inspector to walk the perimeter with her, pulled out the original plat map from her closing documents, and showed him the exact measurements. He verified the boundary and, with a wry smile, said, "Someone's definitely wasting our time." When the inspector left, Susan stood in the driveway for a long moment, then walked to the back of her property. The fire lane stretched out behind her, quiet, clean, unobstructed, just as it should have been from the beginning. She thought of Harold. His daughter had stopped by a few days earlier with a thank-you card. He was recovering, though slowly, and she had said, "I don't think he'd still be here if it wasn't for you." Susan had nodded, accepting the words not as flattery, but as confirmation that her instincts had been right. And yet, the neighborhood's resentment had only grown, because she had disrupted their illusion of control. That evening, a neighbor she didn't know well, an older man who lived across the street, approached her while she was weeding. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. He just said, "You're not wrong, but they won't stop until you embarrass them. Be ready." Then he turned and walked away. It was the first honest interaction Susan had had in weeks. That night, she sat with Caroline on a call discussing the latest developments. Caroline's tone had changed. It was more focused now, more tactical. "They're trying to bury you in annoyance. That's the play. Make you feel surrounded, off balance, unsure. But this only works if you stay reactive." "I don't intend to," Susan said. "I'm done waiting." And with that, they prepared the next step. Not retaliation, but escalation. Because sometimes to end a quiet war, you have to raise your voice just enough to be heard by the people who count. Not the ones who gossip, not the ones who scowl behind windows, but the ones who write the checks, review the permits, and decide who holds power. And Susan McCoy, widow of a fire captain, resident of a quiet cul-de-sac turned battleground, was no longer content to be ignored. The fourth Monday after the incident marked a subtle but unmistakable shift in the neighborhood's balance of power. It came not with a bang or confrontation, but through the weight of official correspondence and carefully placed pressure. That morning, Susan received an envelope from Caroline, delivered not by email, not by messenger, but by certified mail, as if to underline its seriousness. Inside was a drafted formal complaint prepared for submission to the county's Legal Review Board, detailing the sustained pattern of administrative misconduct surrounding the emergency lane violation, as well as the retaliatory actions taken against Susan in the weeks since. Caroline had spent days compiling the evidence, indexing the timeline, referencing municipal codes and precedents, and aligning each incident with clear violations of residential conduct policy and, more significantly, public safety regulations. It was no longer a neighborhood squabble. It was a case. The document was more than just paperwork. It was a trigger, an act that, once released, could not be walked back. Susan read it twice, taking in every word, every reference, and every procedural anchor Caroline had embedded. She could feel the language doing its work, not accusatory, not emotional, but assertive and surgical. When she signed the last page and mailed it that afternoon, she knew the situation had moved into a new phase, one with external oversight and potential legal consequence. Karen could no longer dismiss it as petty drama. The county would now be watching, and with them, the fire department, municipal zoning, and the Community Risk Advisory Board. The neighborhood's petty politics had collided with formal scrutiny, and the impact would be felt soon. That very week, Susan noticed a new presence in the neighborhood. 2 vehicles, unmarked but clearly official, circling the cul-de-sac more than once, pulling over to take photos and notes. One afternoon, a plainclothes woman wearing a lanyard knocked on Susan's door and introduced herself as part of the county's Office of Community Infrastructure. She spoke in that careful, calm tone that officials used when trying to avoid escalating tension. She asked polite but precise questions about the events of the gala evening, the obstructions placed on the emergency lane, the location of key installations, and the timing of the ambulance delay. Susan answered without editorializing, sticking to facts and providing documents when requested. The woman nodded, occasionally making quiet marks on her tablet, but her eyes told Susan everything she needed to know. She wasn't just gathering data, she was confirming what she already suspected. 2 days later, another vehicle appeared, this time with the logo of the Regional Fire Prevention Authority. It parked across from Karen's house, and for 20 minutes, 2 inspectors walked the length of the fire lane, gesturing toward specific areas, referencing blueprints, and marking the ground with small surveyor's flags. Karen was outside at the time, watering her hanging plants. She tried to engage them in conversation, but they ignored her, continuing their work with professional detachment. It was the first time Susan had seen Karen truly unsettled. She stood on her porch, phone in hand, pacing. Her confidence, usually so overwhelming, now looked like it had been built on scaffolding that was finally starting to sway. Behind the scenes, Caroline filed a secondary motion, this one aimed at freezing any attempts by the neighborhood's organizing body to pass new guidelines or amend usage designations on shared property lines until the investigation was complete. It was a protective measure, designed to prevent Karen and her allies from attempting to retroactively rewrite policies or cover their tracks under new administrative language. The county approved it within 48 hours. It wasn't flashy, but it was a critical victory. The board, stripped of its ability to act unilaterally, now had to operate under observation. They were no longer autonomous, they were accountable. That weekend, Susan received a phone call from someone unexpected. Charles Denton, a man who had lived 3 houses down from her since she moved in, and whom she had spoken to perhaps 3 times. His voice was measured, but there was something behind it. Tension and a kind of quiet regret. "I wasn't at the party that night," he said, "but I saw the ambulance. I saw them run. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be involved. But this isn't right anymore. People are afraid to speak, and it's because we let her make the rules. I'm not going to keep doing that." Susan didn't press for details. She simply thanked him and added the call to her timeline notes. But what struck her wasn't just his words. It was the timing. People were beginning to choose sides, not out of loyalty or politics, but because the illusion of neutrality was crumbling. When public safety is breached, when lives are jeopardized and truth becomes blurred under the weight of appearance, there is no middle ground that holds. The middle of that week brought what Susan would later describe as the fulcrum, the point at which things began to tip visibly. A formal hearing was scheduled by the county board, and both Susan and Karen were informed that they would be contacted regarding testimony and evidence. The tone of the communication was crisp, procedural, and non-negotiable. It marked a moment that changed the air in the neighborhood. For the first time, Karen's grip loosened, not because anyone overthrew her, but because the structure she had wrapped herself in was now being dissected, piece by people who didn't care about parties, relationships, or reputations. They cared about compliance, liability, and facts. In response, Karen attempted to regroup. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email, one that danced around the issue but clearly targeted the investigation. She used words like overreach, external interference, and needless disruption of community harmony. She painted the probe as a vendetta, a campaign by discontent individuals with no regard for collective well-being. Susan read it twice and filed it away. She had no intention of replying. The county had already told her not to engage with public back and forth. "Let them speak," Caroline had advised. "Everything they say now is evidence." On Friday, a notice was quietly posted online, a docket listing the names of upcoming hearings, among them the case involving obstruction of public safety infrastructure. It didn't name Susan, but it named the community, and that was enough. News began to trickle through more official circles. A local civic blog picked it up. It wasn't sensational. It was procedural, a public record, but it was visible, and that visibility was all it took for the tide to shift. Susan began to receive small signs, an extra wave from a passing neighbor, an unexpected smile. A bag of fresh tomatoes left at her door with a note that read only, "Thank you." She didn't broadcast these moments, didn't interpret them as victory, lapse, but she felt them as proof that the community was not, as Karen had tried to shape it, a monolith of silence. People were watching. People remembered Harold being wheeled out, and the tables in the way, and the cold look on the medic's face as he ordered them cleared. As the week ended, Susan stood by her back fence and looked down the fire lane. Clear now, lined only by evenly cut grass and the faint shadows of trees. The sun had started to set, casting a warm gold across the asphalt. She thought of Mark, of how he would have handled this, not with rage or noise, but with calm, deliberate action. She imagined him saying, "Do the work, let the facts talk." The facts were talking now, loud and clear. By the time the formal hearing date was announced, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted from passive tension to a kind of brittle stillness, as if the entire community were holding its breath. The announcement, posted on the county website and mailed directly to the residents involved, confirmed what had already been whispered about in driveways and side yards: the investigation into the blocked fire lane and the delayed emergency response was moving forward, and names, real names, were now officially on the record. Karen Hopkins was listed as the respondent in a case alleging endangerment of public safety infrastructure, abuse of administrative authority, and obstruction of emergency services. The hearing would be public, though attendance was limited to registered witnesses and involved parties due to procedural constraints. Susan McCoy was listed as the primary complainant. Karen's response was swift, and for the first time since the ordeal began, it dropped all pretenses of neighborly grace. Within 48 hours, Susan received an official letter, postmarked and notarized, from an attorney representing Karen personally. The letter accused Susan of defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with Karen's community leadership responsibilities. It demanded a retraction of all formal complaints, threatened a countersuit, and warned of consequences beyond the legal realm should this matter proceed. The tone was unmistakable. Bullying masked in professional language, a final attempt to intimidate before the courtroom doors opened. Susan didn't flinch. She forwarded the letter to Caroline, who responded with a one-line email. "This is theater. Let her spend the money." Caroline prepared a brief and filed a notice of protection, essentially freezing any retaliatory actions until after the public hearing concluded. Karen's letter, far from silencing Susan, was added to the growing case file as evidence of sustained pressure and misconduct. The fire department, when contacted for additional testimony, reaffirmed their position. The delay in access due to obstructed infrastructure directly contributed to the degradation of emergency response time, and such an act, regardless of intent, constituted a breach of safety protocols. But legal maneuvering wasn't Karen's only tool. She returned to her true strength: community manipulation. Flyers began appearing again, Anonymous but clearly authored in Karen's clipped rhetorical style. They were taped to community boards, left inside mailboxes, and slipped under doors. They questioned Susan's motivations, painting her as an unstable widow, obsessed with control, and determined to dismantle community unity out of grief. The language was carefully chosen, designed to feel concerned rather than cruel, but the effect was unmistakable. It was a smear campaign built not on facts, but on narrative. A personal attack veiled as communal concern. And then came the targeting. One morning, Susan woke to find her garden vandalized, rows of flowers trampled, a small section of fencing knocked over. There was no graffiti, no symbols, just destruction for the sake of message. She reported it to the police, who logged the incident without much promise of resolution. No witnesses, no cameras facing the street, no clear suspect, the officer said, his voice tired, apologetic. Susan knew what it meant. Nothing would come of it officially. But Caroline advised documenting it thoroughly, photographing everything, time-stamping it all. "You're not alone," she reminded Susan. "You're just in the part of the storm where people try to make you think you are." That same week, Harold's daughter came to see Susan again. She looked more composed this time, though her eyes carried the same raw clarity. She brought cookies, not store-bought but homemade, wrapped in parchment and tied with string. "I heard about the hearing," she said quietly. "I hope they listen. I hope they finally see what this place lets people get away with." Susan thanked her, but said little. She had learned by now that the most powerful moments often didn't need embellishment. As the hearing approached, a final, desperate wave of aggression came. Susan received another letter, this time not from Karen's lawyer, but from the neighborhood's advisory committee. The letter claimed she had violated community decorum guidelines by bringing unnecessary attention to internal matters and inviting external legal scrutiny without exhausting community mediation channels. It was absurd. No such requirement existed in any charter, but the goal was obvious: generate a paper trail of complaints against her before the hearing. Caroline responded with her own letter, this time citing specific county code that protected whistleblowers from retaliatory sanctions within residential governance structures. The message was clear. They had tried the soft power, and now they were escalating to bureaucratic harassment. Then came the anonymous call. It came late one night, 11:43 p.m., from a blocked number. Susan almost didn't answer, but something in her gut told her to pick up. The voice on the other end was distorted, run through a modulator or masked somehow, but the message was unmistakable. "You're making the wrong people angry. Back down now, or you'll wish you had." It was surreal, like something from a movie, but Susan didn't hang up immediately. She listened. She waited. The call ended without another word. She sat in silence for a long time after that, phone still in her hand, the kitchen lights casting long shadows across the floor. Then she called Caroline. The next morning, they filed a police report, a digital harassment complaint, and a request for protective consideration ahead of the hearing. Caroline also contacted the hearing chair to formally log the incident and request increased security for the day of testimony. Susan didn't know if it would come to anything, but she wasn't taking chances anymore. The stakes had risen. The game was no longer local. The weekend before the hearing, Susan noticed a change in the way people looked at her. Not avoidance anymore, not cold politeness, but something more uncertain. Several neighbors nodded to her in passing. One woman dropped off a tray of muffins saying, "Just thought you might need a little support this week." Even Charles Denton, who rarely spoke more than a few words, stood in his yard for a full 10 minutes before finally walking over and saying, "Whatever happens next, you were right to do it." Karen, in contrast, had gone quiet. Her lawn, once a showcase of overmanaged perfection, now looked slightly neglected. Hedges a little longer, flower beds missing their usual vibrancy. She was seen less often, and when she did appear, her expressions were clipped, her movements tense. It wasn't defeat yet, but it was erosion. The night before the hearing, Susan sat at her desk reviewing her notes one last time. She had rehearsed nothing. She would answer truthfully as she always had. The file beside her was thick. Documents, photos, letters, printouts of threatening messages, and statements from neighbors willing to testify or submit written observations. It wasn't just evidence. It was a map of everything they had tried to bury. She didn't feel brave. She felt resolute. Mark's badge sat on the shelf above her desk, next to a photo of them taken just weeks before he died. In the picture, they were smiling on a hiking trail, the sun setting behind them, unaware that their time was running short. She looked at it now, not for comfort, but for alignment. This, she thought, is what it means to carry on. At exactly 9:00 a.m. the next morning, she arrived at the municipal building, documents in hand, chin lifted, footsteps steady. She passed through the security check, entered the hearing room, and sat at the designated table marked for complainants. Karen arrived 10 minutes later, flanked by her attorney, expression composed but brittle. The room was not full. It didn't need to be. What mattered was who had the authority to listen, and who had the courage to speak. The hearing began with a formality that felt, at first, disarming in its simplicity. The paneled room, washed in dull white light and lined with stiff-backed chairs, held the quiet echo of authority. A clerk called the case number, then read the docket title with neutral precision: McCoy versus Residential Safety Oversight Board, regarding obstruction of emergency infrastructure. The presiding officer, a retired judge appointed by the county to handle municipal oversight cases, introduced herself and reviewed the procedural structure of the session. Her tone was even, her face unreadable. She gave no indication of sympathy, no indulgent nods or warning glances. It was clear from the start. What mattered here were facts, process, and testimony, not politics, not reputation, not charisma. Susan sat composed, her hands lightly clasped on the table, the folder in front of her sealed but ready. Caroline sat beside her, dressed with quiet authority, exuding a confidence born from preparation, not bravado. On the opposite side, Karen Hopkins sat flanked by her attorney, a man in a deep navy suit with the posture of someone accustomed to billing by the hour. Karen's usual brightness had dulled. The perfect smile was missing. Her eyes darted slightly more than normal, and her shoulders seemed pinned forward by invisible weight. The hearing began with the opening statement from Susan's side. Caroline spoke clearly, laying out the chain of events: the initial obstruction of the fire lane, the emergency incident involving delayed medical access, the subsequent actions taken by Karen Hopkins without official approval, and the repeated efforts to obfuscate, intimidate, and retaliate against the complainant. She did not embellish. She cited municipal code, referenced witness affidavits, included statements from the fire department, and presented time-stamped photographic evidence. When she finished, she simply said, "We are here today not for vengeance, but to restore accountability where it was deliberately eroded." Then it was Susan's turn. She was not asked to perform, only to describe. She spoke without paper, recounting the day of the event, the arrival of the ambulance, the impossibility of access, the frantic removal of tables and archways, and the expressions on the faces of the paramedics as they carried the equipment in by hand. Her voice was steady, but the memory of that helpless moment, watching trained professionals forced to maneuver around centerpieces and cocktail stations, remained vivid. When asked how it felt, she did not speak in metaphors. She said plainly, "It felt like watching the price of negligence in real time, and I knew I couldn't pretend it didn't matter." Then came the witnesses. A city inspector confirmed that no permits had been filed for temporary structures on the fire lane. A fire department official stated that in his 21 years of service, he had never encountered a blocked access point during an active medical emergency in a residential zone until that night. A neighbor, previously silent, submitted a signed statement that Karen had insisted the fire lane was fair game because no one ever uses it. And then came Harold's daughter. Her testimony was short but devastating. She spoke only of the moment she realized the ambulance wasn't moving forward, of hearing one paramedic curse under his breath, then grab a defibrillator and run, of how she watched them disappear around the corner of a hedge, knowing her father's life might depend on whether or not a table could be pushed fast enough. Karen's attorney objected only once, when a reference was made to the neighborhood-wide email sent days after the incident, which Susan had preserved in full. The presiding officer allowed it in, ruling it as relevant in demonstrating intent and public narrative shaping. Karen shifted slightly in her seat at that moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. When her turn came, Karen spoke with all the finesse of someone who had rehearsed every word. She denied malicious intent, insisted she had believed the lane was merely an aesthetic buffer zone, and claimed she had verbally consulted a former board member about usage guidelines. She apologized, but it was the kind of apology that held no weight, conditional, performative, and strategically placed. When asked why she had placed signs directing guests to park along the access lane, she said, "It was an oversight by the planning team. I delegated too much." When questioned about the retaliation campaign, the anonymous flyers and the targeted complaints against Susan, she replied, "I can't control what others choose to say or do." Her attorney added, with practiced indignation, that the case was inflated beyond proportion and amounted to a personal vendetta wrapped in legalese. The presiding officer asked few questions, but when she did, they were surgical. "Ms. Hopkins, are you aware of the municipal code prohibiting any obstruction of designated emergency lanes, temporary or permanent?" Karen replied, "Not at the time." The officer's response was a flat. Ignorance of law is not a legal defense. By the end of the day, the tension in the room was almost chemical. No one shouted. No accusations flew. But the weight of the truth, layered across hours of calm, irrefutable testimony, settled like lead in the space between them. The ruling did not come that day. The officer announced that a written decision would be issued within 5 business days. The hearing adjourned, and just like that, the participants stood, gathered their documents, and left the room. No applause, no immediate justice, just paperwork and exhaustion. Susan stepped into the hallway, the cool air brushing against her skin like a reminder to breathe. She didn't feel victorious. She felt drained. But beneath that exhaustion, a sense of alignment had settled, like something finally placed back where it belonged. She returned home that evening to silence. No neighbors watching, no flyers, just the sound of her garden sprinkler and the occasional bird overhead. Caroline called to say, "You did exactly what needed to be done. Now we wait. But I expect the ruling will be thorough. She can't spin her way out of this." 3 days later, the decision arrived. The presiding officer found Karen Hopkins in violation of multiple municipal regulations regarding the obstruction of emergency access infrastructure, as well as improper use of common space without permit or safety clearance. The officer noted that while no direct intent to harm was proven, the actions displayed a gross disregard for public safety and a disturbing pattern of administrative overreach. The fine imposed was $25,000, to be paid by the organizing body, responsible for the event, with Karen listed as the coordinating party. Additionally, the officer referred the matter to the Residential Ethics Committee for review of Karen's continued eligibility to serve in any capacity related to community governance. The ruling was final. No appeals, no stays, just accountability. Finally, clearly, officially rendered. Susan read the letter in full, then set it down. She looked out her window at the fire lane, empty, quiet, and perfectly clear. Not a car in sight, not a planter, not a string of lights, just clean asphalt leading to what it was always meant for. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just exhaled. A long, steady breath that seemed to carry more weight than any words ever could. In the weeks following the ruling, the neighborhood shifted in ways both small and irreparable. On the surface, life resumed with a sense of forced normalcy. Lawns were mowed, packages arrived on time, dogs barked in the distance, but something beneath the surface had fractured. The quiet, insulated illusion of a community governed by unspoken rules and curated civility had given way to the reality of accountability. There were no parades, no formal announcements, no headlines in the local papers. But everyone knew. The fire lane remained clear, the fine had been issued and confirmed, and Karen Hopkins no longer stood as the quiet authority presiding over cul-de-sac matters with a clipboard and a cocktail invitation. She did not resign publicly, but within a month of the ruling, her name was quietly removed from the advisory board list. The email newsletters stopped arriving. The once pristine decorations that had adorned her lawn disappeared. Her elaborate planter boxes wilted under neglect, and the lights that once cast her front walkway in a soft glow went dark, one by one. Susan McCoy did not celebrate. She moved through the aftermath with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the heart of the storm. She returned to her routines, morning walks by the fire lane, tending her garden, answering polite greetings with brief but firm nods. But now, people met her eyes differently. There was no longer avoidance or suspicion. Instead, there was something quieter, respect, perhaps, or acknowledgement. Several neighbors, ones who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, began to reintroduce themselves in understated ways. A knock on the door with a borrowed tool returned. A wave from across the street where once there had only been turned backs. Even the postman, who had once hesitated at her gate, now offered a small, familiar salute. One afternoon, Susan found a letter in her mailbox, not from any official office, but handwritten, neatly folded, and unsigned. The paper was cream-colored, the ink black and steady. The message was short. What you did mattered. I didn't have the courage to say it then. I'm sorry. Thank you. She read it once, then again, then placed it gently into the same folder where she had stored all the documents, photos, and records from the past months. It would remain there, not as evidence, but as testament. In the evenings, she sat on her back porch with a book in her lap and tea cooling slowly beside her. From where she sat, she could see the top of the fire lane, unobstructed, framed by the silhouettes of trees now dense with midsummer leaves. The lane itself had become a kind of symbol, an ordinary stretch of pavement once taken for granted, now standing as a boundary line between complacency and responsibility. No one parked there anymore. No children left their bikes or toys strewn across its entrance. It had been reclaimed, not by law alone, but by understanding. Even those who had once dismissed Susan's warnings now seemed to understand the weight of what had been risked. Harold recovered, slowly but steadily. His daughter visited often, and occasionally Susan would see them walking together in the late mornings, his steps still cautious but determined. They never made a show of their gratitude, but they always stopped to wave. And once, as they passed her garden, Harold removed his cap and nodded, the gesture heavy with all the words they never needed to say out loud. Karen remained in the neighborhood, but her presence shrank. She no longer hosted events or appeared at gatherings. Occasionally, Susan caught sight of her leaving the house or walking toward her car with her head slightly lowered. There was no confrontation between them, no forced apology or dramatic reconciliation. Only distance and the knowledge that the line had been drawn and crossed, and that consequences had finally followed. Perhaps that was its own form of justice. Susan never spoke of what she had done as heroic. When neighbors cautiously brought it up, she deflected with the same clarity that had defined her throughout the process. "I just did what anyone should have done," she would say. But she knew better. Not everyone would have stood up. Not everyone could have withstood the pressure, the isolation, the backlash disguised as bureaucracy. But she had. Not for pride, not for legacy, but because something inside her refused to accept that silence was safer than truth. Months passed, and seasons shifted. By fall, the community had begun a quiet reorganization. A new advisory committee was formed, this time with open nominations and transparent voting. Susan declined to run. When asked why, she simply said, "I've done my part. Now it's someone else's turn." But she attended the first meeting, sitting quietly in the back, observing as the structure she had once watched collapse was now being rebuilt, piece by careful piece. In November, the fire department sent her a letter, formal, typed, and stamped. It expressed appreciation for her role in protecting emergency access and for her unwavering commitment to public safety. It wasn't grandiose. It didn't come with a ceremony, but it meant something. Susan framed it and placed it beside Mark's photo, not because she needed recognition, but because it felt like something he would have appreciated. A quiet act of honor returned in kind. One evening, as the year drew to a close and the sky darkened earlier with each passing day, Susan stood by the fire lane and watched as city workers installed a new signpost. Bolder, more reflective, marked clearly with the emblem of the local, Emergency Services. It read, "Emergency Access. Do not block enforced." Beneath it, a smaller placard had been added, "Dedicated in memory of those who protect what we take for granted." She didn't know who had suggested the addition. It hadn't come from her. But when she saw it, she felt something shift. Not closure, not victory, but continuity. A sense that what had begun as a single voice in a sea of silence had become something lasting. And as she turned to walk back to her house, the lane behind her clear, the air crisp and still, Susan McCoy finally allowed herself to feel what she hadn't since the beginning. Not triumph, not vindication, but peace. Earned, measured, and complete.